I'm pleased to send this message to everybody celebrating the Mossman Parks and Bushland Association's 50th anniversary. For 50 years, the Mossman Parks and Bushland Association has protected local bushland and national parks from environmental degradation.
Gathered in a hall on this bright sunny afternoon on Sydney's North Shore are bush regenerators of all ages and from many parts of the city. Some are veterans of the movement, but many of the pioneers are no longer with us, including the two sisters who started it all in Mossman.
This anniversary is also an opportunity to acknowledge the contribution of Eileen and Joan Bradley, the creators of the Bradley Method. Their work changed the way we look after bushland.
I spoke to her on the phone. She said, the people you need to meet are the Bradleys from Mossman, these two eccentric but amazing women who live in Mossman, and they are developing a whole new approach to bushland.
Yes, I read in the local paper about these women, and there was a photo of them, and I said to my mother, I really admire these women, you know, I'd like to help. So I rang them up.
Who did you speak to?
I spoke to Joan, and she was very pleased to. She had quite a loud sort of English cultured, I thought. She didn't have the ordinary sort of Aussie drawl.
Well, she wasn't going to have it. She didn't want us.
Why?
Well, we were not trained. And she said, no, she really didn't have a place. It was mainly, I don't know whether she said it was for Mossman people, but she didn't want us.
You got that impression at some stage?
Well, she said no, she didn't. She couldn't take us. Heather rang up. Heather said, I'm not going to accept this. So she rang up and said, could she come? This Heather, yes. Yeah. And Joan said no. So Heather said, well, we're going to do it anyway. So she said, I'll come next Saturday.
So,
were you taught by Joan then?
yes.
What was she like as a teacher?
Well, she's very strict.
How did that come across?
Oh, that was so I could cope with. Some people found her a bit frightening. She was very, authoritarian, I suppose, in her approach.
Which is frightening.
Frightening?
Yeah, I was marvellous.
In what way was she frightening?
Well, she was like the headmistress of school headmistress, she was very... Well, we were a lot younger then, of course. We just felt under her thumb in a way.
Did you get into trouble?
Oh, yes. Yes, we used to get into trouble.
For what?
Oh, for having big feet and treading on things and pulling out things that we shouldn't.
Joan was a very individual person. She smoked like a chimney.
Yes, she was. Smoked all the time. But she had her own little ashtray with a lid on it, that she stubbed them out.
She never went anywhere without her dog Velvet in the bush and everywhere, which people don't really approve of.
These days she wouldn't get away with it, would she?
She would not get away with it.
The smoking or the dogs?
Neither.
As we walked in the bush, we had to walk one behind the other and walk in somebody else's footsteps so we didn't tread on any treasures.
So it's a softly.
So, very softly, which was good, learning that way, because you really got to look at to really look at the small things.
Joan, could you describe your program of weed eradication?
Well, it's essentially a program of helping the natives to battle the weeds.
Well, the Bradley sisters were called rat bags, yes.
By who?
Well, by most people.
In the beginning, the Bradley sisters stumbled on what was later to become the Bradley Method. Walking their dogs on what was left of the bushland around Mossman, they noticed weeds and something else once they pulled the weeds out.
And then they found that the native plants came back, and the previous method of dealing with weeds was councils and others would just come in with big tools and sort of nuke the place and then be amazed that, more weeds came back.
I worked with the Bradley sisters in late 68 and 69 and 70 on Bradley's Head. And we were bush regenerators, but we had to follow their procedure, which we had never heard of. They would say, don't upset the dirt. Start from the good area and work into the bad, because we wanted to just get in and thrash around. The lantana was the biggest problem because it was 20 foot high.
Lantana, weed of national significance. Origin, horticultural hybrid based on Central and South American stock.
And the council would go in gangbusters and slash and burn, and it would all be back in 6 months. So these ladies had us like tickling the roots.
Tickling
Out the roots of the lantana, with almost little brushes and little things to make sure you got the roots right to the very bottom, and so you got the roots out, and not just go slash and burn with the branches.
So this was very delicate work.
It was very delicate, silent work. We were just silent. You just see bums up in the air. They often wore skirts to do their work in. And so you'd see the bums up in the air, and heads down, as people were silent.
We were always over clearing down here along when we first started in '68 as the volunteers, because we were so enthusiastic. But Joan didn't like that. She'd come down and she never hesitated to tell you what you were doing wrong, which I liked, actually. You weren't mucking around. She was, in some ways, she was a very powerful player, actually, and you had to sort of get used to that. But I liked her from the very first minute I met her. She was very good fun. And she was an enormously interesting woman, because she'd had all these other things that she'd been fanatical about, her kelpie dogs and the irises and the blue wrens and, all these campaigns that she'd been involved in seriously. And then she drifted into bush regenerating because of the walk they used to take with the dogs every day, as you know.
On the surface, the sisters had a conventional middle-class upbringing. Eileen was born in 1911, Joan in 1916, the third and fourth daughters of a dentist. Joan worked as an industrial chemist. Later, with their widowed mother, the sisters ran a decorating business from their Mossman home. But by the 1960s, times were changing. New, previously unthinkable alliances were being formed.
There must be some way out of here.
It was definitely time for change. We had had a long period during the 40s and 50s, post-war era, where there was a great deal of conservatism. And there were lots and lots of these groups, bushwalkers clubs and so on, around Sydney at the time, who were thinking differently. No, they weren't accepting the conventional dogma that humans prevail over nature, really. And then, of course, was the book Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and I think people were taking seriously the need to observe nature and to interact with it in a much more responsible and responsive way.
It was known as Sydney's most unlikely alliance of the 1970s. 13 women from the leafy suburb of Hunters Hill joined builders' labourers to save a piece of the harbour side from developers.
They might be much older and less agile than they were 36 years ago, but the women dubbed the Battlers for Kelly's Bush are just as sharp and determined. The idea to save a rare piece of bushland on the Parramatta River was conceived at a dinner party in 1970.
The mayor at one stage said, "They're just a group of bloody housewives." I know, I've investigated, and that's all we were, just a group of bloody housewives.
It all began with Ashton Park, now part of the Sydney Harbour National Park. If a piece of land is covered in lantana and weeds, it can be dismissed as just a piece of worthless land, and who would want to preserve it? The story was told by Betty James, one of the battlers for Kelly's Bush over at Woolwich in the 1970s, of rising nervously to talk at the battlers' meeting and seeing the face of our association's Joan Bradley and June Graham radiating encouragement from the front row. Kelly's Bush was a case of degraded land playing into the hands of the developers. The Bradley sisters, as they're known, lived in Iluka Road and became familiar with the bush in that area as they walked their dogs and made surveys of birds. The bushland was full of weeds, lantana and other non-natives. Everyone wanted something done about the weeds, but it became obvious that the methods of the day weren't working. In fact, they often made the problem worse. In a letter to a friend, Joan Bradley wrote, "The council hacked away at Ashton Park, but of course it grew back into lantana practically overnight. We found that as we began to pull away weeds in good bush, we could see that the bush began to help itself.
Joan Bradley was a classic polymath, whether studying blue wrens, carpentry, or skillfully using the media to spread the word of the Bradley method.
Well, the three basic principles that we work on is that we work always, and this is absolutely vital, from the good areas towards the bad ones. This means that we take out the weeds in conditions which favour the natives, and you get quick replacement. The second is that we try to keep the ground in the condition which favours natives and not weeds. Keep a seed bed that favours what we want to grow in it. And the third one is that we gear our clearing rate to our regeneration rate, and we never move on to further clearing until we've stabilised the last area we cleared.
For bush regenerators to exist, first there had to be weeds. And by the time the sisters were developing the Bradley method, weeds were a massive but little understood source of bush invasion, as the city's suburbs spread rapidly into the bush, bringing all manner of invasive weeds with them. By the 1970s, the Bradley method was well established.
Yes.
The Bradley sisters have dedicated themselves to preserving the authentic Australian beauty of the Headland Park. For more than 20 years, they've been working over every inch of it, making war on weeds and helping the native plants and shrubs. So far, the Bradleys have regenerated some 40 acres, about half the park area that adjoins their home. The sisters have acquired so much knowledge of the bush during their 20 years' fight against weeds that they've written 3 books which have wide respect among conservationists. Some of their theories conflict with those held by professional park workers.
Despite opposition from traditionalists, Joan Bradley was good at convincing people that bush regen could produce excellent results.
So you got really very slick at getting weeds out of the ground without churning things up and without busting ourselves in the process. It doesn't require a great deal of strength, but it requires a great deal of finesse.
And what sort of time do you have to put into keeping the bush up once it's actually been reclaimed?
Oh, the dramatic fall from the initial clearing to the final long-term maintenance. One site in a reserve at Beecroft, primary clearing took 90 man-hours. The following year, 6 man-hours were worked picking up stray exotics. The next year, it was 1.5, and the following year it was 1.25. And I should say it would probably stay pretty steady at 1.25.
And what are the advantages in your eyes of having the countryside in bushland rather than planted out with exotics?
Well, I wouldn't want the whole countryside in bushland, but I would like to see what's left preserved as it should be.
It was certainly a delicate approach.
Oh, very, very delicate.
And everyone tells me that Joan and Eileen were both great observers.
Oh, yes. Very, very great observers, yes. And we had to be. We had to have a glass round our neck. You know, we have looked at everything.
An eyeglass.
Eyeglass, yes, yes. So we looked at the small stuff.
It was mostly women involved in bush regeneration.
Was. Men had big feet and they were rough. Yes, they were not that keen on men.
We moved into Castle Crag in 1978. We have a large block of land and we didn't know what the hell we were going to do, how we were going to look after it. We were led by one person to another and to another. You've got to learn about the National Trust's management of bushland and the Bradley method of bush regeneration. You had to learn all your weeds and all your natives. It was very, very strict and very good. Joan was a very, very strict taskmaster and she was very open-minded. If you could show to Joan that there was a better way of doing something, be it sharpening a knife or whatever, Joan would consider it. If it was reasonable, logical, she would adopt it.
The Bradley method spread through the Sydney suburbs, with volunteer bush groups springing up, as well as companies working as paid contractors. Joan Bradley and Tony May started the first bush regen company, Bradley and May. By the 80s, councils were radically rethinking their bush management strategy.
Yeah, it was an enormous change. I guess it really did start with Evelyn Hickey and the National Trust. She, in fact, employed Joan to do bush regeneration on National Trust sites. So the National Trust is not just buildings, and the Trust does have a few natural sites around Sydney. So she employed Joan and a team of workers, including me, and she also had enough nous to get out and advertise doing bushland surveys of the local council areas. What resources do you actually have? What ecosystem do you have? And how should you manage them? And obviously, we were always going to say some bush regeneration. So she was really, really important in getting bush regeneration around the Sydney area.
While the National Trust played a big part in giving bush regen momentum, it was also pivotal in a row that would split the movement in the future.
What was the attitude of the Bradley sisters to poison, using poison?
Oh, no, they weren't into poison at all at this stage.
When she started doing bush regeneration, they were horrible things like the arsenics and Agent Orange and really very dangerous chemicals.
It was only after we'd been working for a long time her attitude to poisoning changing.
She was a scientist and, yeah, she was prepared to accept new ideas. But many of her followers weren't.
And I recall my own copy that I bought quite early had a piece of paper glued over that section.
In the modern sense, the bush means everything, and therefore almost nothing. It is 9/10 nonsense. As it did in the beginning, the looseness of the term speaks not only for the difficulty of defining something so various and changeable, but for the way the landscape often overwhelmed both our ability and our desire to understand. Watson, the bush.
This area needs attention.
Teen MacDonald clearly remembers how Joan Bradley's attitude was changing, becoming out of step with some of her more ardent disciples.
Absolutely, she was trialling the use of certain herbicides, and that was even typed into her original book, Bush Regeneration. And I recall my own copy had a piece of paper glued over that section. So obviously that there were some quite strident anti-herbicide people who were supporting Joan, and after her death, that became the rule that herbicide was not preferred.
But then Roundup or glyphosate came in, and she could see it could be injected straight into the trunk and not sprayed. She was totally against spraying, and some of those early herbicides before glyphosate were really terrible, 1080 and all of that. So when she could see this much safer and only a very small amount applied, she was interested in using that in a limited way.
Joan Bradley had died in 1982, her sister Eileen 6 years earlier. Both women had made a tremendous contribution to the evolution of bush regeneration.
After a recent weeding session in Ashton Park, Joan and Eileen Bradley talked with reporter Jim Revitt.
Well, it's essentially a program of helping the natives to battle the weeds.
Sketch of Joan, my first word is going to be she was really scary. She seemed to know everything and she had very strong opinions. She was really good at sharing her knowledge, but she wasn't very nice if we made a mistake and we accidentally pulled out a native instead of a weed. We've all got stories of thinking, whoops, we've done the wrong thing, and hiding the mistake so we didn't get spoken to.
Because if you start where the weeds are worst and work towards the bush, you bring the weeds with you. If you do it the opposite way, you bring the bush with you.
But an incredible legacy.
Oh, an incredible legacy. I mean, it's still called the Bradley method. She got it out and around. Bush regeneration simply wouldn't have existed without her. So, a great legacy.
Do you plant shrubs and flowers?
No, this isn't necessary.
Because she said to me, I heard her one day, she said, I'll be 65 soon. And I thought, oh, you must be feeling, I thought 65 was as old as the hills then. And I thought, oh, you're feeling your age. And I organised a 65th birthday party for her in Baton Reserve, and that was lovely. Everybody came from all over. And she died not long after.
Do you both find it satisfying work?
Gorgeous. Immensely satisfying, yes.
Meanwhile, bush regen continued to grow, thanks in large part to the publication of a book which was to become hugely influential, despite its almost casual beginnings.
It was one of those conversations one has round the photocopier the boss at Ryde TAFE said, "Robin, would you like to write a book on bush regeneration?" And at that stage, I was young, poor, needing any work I could get. I said, yes, I said.
Robin Buchanan's Bush Regeneration, Recovering Australian Landscapes was published in 1989.
But you're being a bit modest. That was actually used as a manual for some of the early students who went to TAFE.
Yes, it was. And
what was it really seen as an industry in those days?
It was by a narrow group of people seen as an industry, but a lot of people just saw it as weird volunteers. It is still sometimes seen that way. But the book developed into something quite large. TAFE then decided to distribute it in bookshops. So it went round Australia.
Natural areas are important. They provide us with practical services such as clean air and water, and control erosion and insects. They also give us the simple pleasures of interacting with a rich and diverse world. Their conservation and restoration need to be carefully balanced with production and development, as overexploitation leads to degradation of both natural and developed areas. Dust storms and contaminated water benefit no one. Restoring Natural Areas in Australia. Robin A. Buchanan.
A book established it, I think, as a legitimate industry. It was something that really existed, and I think that was the real take-off of bush regeneration around Australia.
Not just something done by ratbags on a...
Not just something done by fringe greenies, that's exactly right.
The 50th anniversary celebrations for the Mossman Parks and Bushland Association on Sydney's North Shore included a guided tour of the site and mention of one of the touchiest subjects in the bush.
So the Bradley sisters, when they started their bush regeneration and they noticed that fire had gone through, apart from the natives responding to this benefit, the weeds responded too. So this is where I do a lot of my work here in this area. So after the fire went through, the weeds that started to shoot were very obvious, and we were able to get in and knock them out to give the native plants a competitive advantage. And that's the secret of the Bradley method.
It was always half on fire. Fire made it, and in doing so disposed it to burning. For several million years, lightning amply satisfied that need, until the Aborigines arrived and in time made fire a way of life. The Bush, by Don Watson.
The use of fire as a tool in bush regeneration was one of the main changes, one of the milestones in bush regeneration. Ecosystems that are adapted to fire may need fire to be applied as part of the restoration process. In bush regeneration, we only use fire in small areas.
If the short history of bush regen is anything to go by, there'll always be strong, feisty characters about to fight the weeds. Far too many to give proper credit to here. The spirit, drive and commitment of the Bradleys lives on, and today new generations of bush regenerators are doing battle with new generations of bush invaders.